Today I have a guest for this YouTube video, and that's Dr. Chris Kirk, and he presents what we're really trying to achieve in training, and he covers the various acute and chronic training outcomes we're trying to achieve and how that relates to sports performance and how you can use this framework to improve your training and your sporting performance outcomes within combat sports. Now, if you go down the description, there's a link to the Sweet Science of Fighting Underground, and that link will support Chris. Chris is also within the private community there, so you can talk to Chris directly within that Discord channel, but you also get access to all the training programs and courses. But enjoy.
Hi everyone, Dr. Chris Kirk here, and I'm just going to do a video where I discuss this paper by Annie Jeffries and team, which came out in 2021. And in this paper, the authors propose a conceptual framework for coaches, trainers, researchers, practitioners to use to think about the training process that we use when working with athletes and understanding what the athlete is trying to achieve and how we can go about helping them achieve those goals. So the reason why I'm looking at this conceptual framework is because if you're a member of this community, this site, you have an interest in developing combat sport athletes from potentially a physiological perspective, potentially from a nutritional perspective, and potentially from a psychological perspective. So you're interested in developing the athlete as an organism in order to improve their performance. Now, this particular framework gives, in my opinion, a really strong process to work through and structure your thinking around in order to develop them physiologically. So let's have a look at this framework. I'm going to go through step by step what each stage of the framework is aimed at providing for us and how we can use it when working with our athletes. So this is the framework proposed by the paper, and I recommend downloading the paper and having a read through in detail each stage of the framework as well. Alongside this description, you'd start thinking about how you can use it in your practice. So at first glance, it does look a bit complicated. It looks like there's different stuff going on all over the place. So let's have a discussion about each stage. So the first thing to highlight is this circle over here, where essentially the athlete themselves would be. So whenever we're working with an athlete, we have to have an understanding of who they are as a person, what their physiological and physical capacities and capabilities are, and also the training environment in which they operate and the competition standard that they are currently at. So if they are a regional development athlete, they're going to have different requirements than if they are getting ready for a world title bout, or if they're getting ready to go to the Olympic qualifiers, or if they are just competing for fun and enjoyment. Okay, so we have to have a consideration of all of these factors when we're starting to think about how we're going to train this athlete and what they need to be prepared for. So everything else on the framework links back in to the individual and contextual factors. But the individual contextual factors also have a direct influence on everything else within the framework. Now, if you notice, the only part of the framework that doesn't have a link directly to the individual is this part up here, the training prescription. Now, that is entirely separate to the individual and contextual factors, because the training prescription is, well, that comes from you as the person supporting their development. Okay, the training prescription is the training that is given to that athlete either as part of their technical tactical sessions or as part of their strength and conditioning sessions. So the training prescription is something given to the athlete. It's something prescribed to the person training. It's external to that person. Now, the training prescription leads to two types of load: external training load and internal training load. Now, many of you might have heard these terms before. Many of you might not have heard these terms before. So I'm just going to give a brief description, a brief definition of what these two factors are. So first of all, The external training load are the physical actions that the athlete completes or takes part in as part of their training. So if we're asking the participant, if we're asking the athlete to take part in 45 minutes of bag work or 30 minutes of grappling drills, then that is their external load. That is the load placed on them by the training prescription. It's the physical actions that the athlete is required to complete as part of their training. Now, their internal load is the athlete's physiological responses to the external load. So, how does their physiology respond to enable them to complete the external load? Now, the internal load could be an acute increase in heart rate. It could be an acute increase in breathing rate. It could be an acute increase in their muscle and blood lactate. It could also be the feelings of exertion caused by bearing your training partner's mass. So, for instance, if you're doing jiu-jitsu training and you're on bottom in guard and you're trying to prevent your opponent from passing your guard, you're going to be experiencing their body mass, their weight pressing down on your body. And you're also going to be having them press their elbows and their forearms into the muscles of your thighs and your hips and around your ribs. That is part of the external load. Similarly, if you take part in a Muay Thai sparring session, the external load will include the impact on your skeletal muscular system of the strikes as your opponent is sparring you. So all of these things, and one more thing that people often forget about, if you're doing a drill-based session, so if you're doing what would be perceived as a low intensity drill session where you're just doing some low impact pad work, for instance, that still has a relatively high level of internal load because the person, the athlete, is using a high amount of cognitive capacity in order to think about the drills that they're doing, in order to think about the new techniques that they're learning, and how to incorporate that into their movement, into their repertoire, and into their overall game. So the cognitive, mental aspect of training would also be part of their internal training load. So just a quick recap. The external training load are the physical actions that the athlete completes as part of their training. The internal training load is all of the body's physiological and cognitive responses to the external load. Now, these two are not always equivalent. They're dependent on how the individual and their context is affecting them on a daily basis. The internal training load on one day might be higher or lower to the exact same external training load on another day. So that's something important to bear in mind. So we prescribe training. That leads to physical actions, which is the athlete's external training load, and their physiology responds in a certain way. Now that leads us into a series of training effects. Now these training effects is the whole point of the training in the first place. We are not asking the athletes to perform certain things in their training just to do that training. And in a way, we're not really asking the athletes to perform certain things in their training to bring about an internal training load. What we're actually aiming for is to bring about some sort of adaptation or response from their physiology. And those are the training effects. Now, there's 4 segments to the training effects. We have acute positive, acute negative, chronic positive, and chronic negative. Now, when we're talking about physiological responses, acute means short term, so immediate at the time of the training. Chronic means long term, the adaptations that take place over days, weeks, and months of training. So when we have a training effect, let's say we have our athletes do 25 minutes of jiu-jitsu rolling. Okay, so they're doing 25 minutes, 4 rounds with rest periods in between. They're going to have a series of acute positive and acute negative physiological responses. The acute positive responses might be an increase in joint mobility. It might be an increased use of glycogen and fat for energy resynthesis. It might be an increased breathing rate or an increased feeling of motivation and self-efficacy because they've been able to complete their training in the way they wanted to. Now, acute negative, from a physiological standpoint, is going to be an increased amount of hydrogen ions and lactate within the muscle and the blood, increasing the acidity of the muscle. It might be an increased feeling of muscle soreness due to the opponent mass bearing and due to the damage done to the sarcomeres from working against the resistance. Now, these are negative effects because they are reducing the physiological capacity of the person in an acute moment in time. Now, alongside that, there's also going to be a reduction of available glycogen, which is going to lead to increased feelings of fatigue, which is going to increase their rate of perceived exertion. So they're going to feel more tired. But all of these effects are only acute. You stop training, you go through your cool down, those hydrogen ions and the lactate will be cleared. You take on a meal, glycogen will be restored, the person is going to feel more recovered. So these acute positive and acute negative training effects occur during the training session themselves. Now, positive and negative are loaded words here. Okay, we use the word negative to mean negative things. But from a physiological standpoint, the acute negative training effects lead to chronic positive training effects. Now, if you increase the amount of hydrogen ions within the muscle, you are actually leading onto a chronic positive effect that the muscle will be better at buffering against those increased hydrogen ions. Now, if you do that repeatedly over several months, then you will be able to complete high intensity work for longer. You're increasing your muscle's ability to work in an anaerobic state. That is a chronic positive effect. If you have an acute negative effect of reducing the amount of glycogen repeatedly through training, then that's going to lead on to a chronic positive effect of allowing the muscle to work to metabolize fats more as an energy source. So that is a chronic positive effect. If you bring on an acute negative effect of having the sarcomeres, the muscle, go through damage from having to work against resistance, then that's going to bring about a chronic positive effect of increasing the number of actin and myosin filaments within the muscle fiber itself and increasing its resistance to that damage. So this is what we're actually trying to achieve through our training. We are bringing about acute positive and acute negative training effects to hopefully lead us to chronic positive training effects. Now, the chronic negative training effects, these can also occur. Now, these acute negative training effects will only become chronic positive effects if the athlete is given sufficient time to rest and recover, and if the training stimulus provided changes on a regular basis. Now, that regular basis could be once every 3 to 4 weeks, as seen in classic periodization. In more intense training periods, for instance, in the final month of a training camp, daily to weekly changes in that acute negative training stimulus might be required. But again, that's all dependent on the individual and contextual factors. Now, if the same acute negative training effects are provided to the athlete on a repeated basis for a long period of time without sufficient recovery and restitution, then you will actually end up with chronic negative training effects. Over the long term, the training effects are starting to become negative. The muscle is not given a chance to rest and recover. So it will not produce actin and myosin filaments at a sufficient rate in order to bring about strength or impulse improvements. The athlete isn't being given a chance to consume enough macronutrients in response to their training. They're not being given a chance to mentally recover from training sessions. So the grind and the burden of repetitive training again and again means that they are mentally fatigued. So what we're trying to do, we are trying to bring about acute positive and acute negative training stimuli and training effects, leading on to chronic positive effects and avoiding chronic negative effects. Now, all of these four things occur in training. They lead on to our sports performance outcomes. Now, this is the key part of this framework. This is the key thing that we're building up towards. The whole point of training is to improve our athletes' sport performance outcomes. Now, those sport performance outcomes can either be measured as an improvement. So the athlete gets stronger, they get faster, they have improved technique, they're able to endure more, both from an aerobic and anaerobic standpoint, and they're able to recover faster. That's what we want. That is the end product. If you get to the end of a training camp and you're not seeing an improvement in those things, that training camp has not worked. If we do not see improvements in their physiological capacities at the end of a training camp, the training camp has been ineffective. And we could also see no change. So if they get to the end of a training camp and there is no change in their strength, there is no change in their power/impulse, and there is no change in their aerobic or anaerobic capacities, then again, has the training camp been successful or not? I would argue no, it hasn't. Now, we could also see a decrement in their sport performance outcomes. If you find that your athlete has gotten weaker or slower or reduced aerobic capacity, then at the end of a training camp, that is definitely a bad thing. That is something that we do not want to happen. However, during the training camp itself, we should expect to see decrements in performance. We should expect them to have reduced aerobic capacity, or reduced anaerobic capacity, or reduced strength, or reduced speed. We should expect them to have reduced mental and cognitive capacity. The reason why we should expect that is because that's called functional overreaching. If they do not have reduced strength, reduced aerobic capacity, reduced anaerobic capacity, or increased feelings of fatigue during a training camp, then there is no acute negative training stimulus being provided. The acute negative training stimulus is what causes the chronic positive training effects. Without the acute negative effects, you will not get chronic positive training effects. So during a training camp, at various stages, we should see a decrement in performance. Now, this is called functional overreaching. We do need it as athletes. Now, if that decrement in performance continues for a long period of time, now, as a general rule of thumb in a training camp, 3 to 4 weeks of continuing decreased performance, then we class that as non-functional overreaching. Generally speaking, they're not being given enough time to rest and recover, or they're not taking on the required macronutrients in order to recover. That's a bad thing. We need to revisit our training plan and adjust the training. Now, it could also end up being overtraining. If this decrement in performance goes on for weeks and months without changes in their recovery, then we can classify this as overtraining, particularly if we have provided more rest periods, if we have adjusted the training, if we have ensured that they are taking on sufficient macronutrients, but there's still decrement in performance, then they are potentially suffering from overtraining syndrome. And that requires a drastic rethink in the athlete's training and support. Now, the big question comes in how do we measure these things? What are we actually looking for in terms of improvement, performance, or decrement? What kind of things should we measure? Well, this is where the trickiest part comes in for combat sports, because it all hinges on what our sport performance outcomes are. Now, sport performance outcome for some events is really easy and straightforward. If you're working with a 100-meter sprinter, for instance, in athletics, then your sport performance outcome is how quick they're completing 100 meters. If during your training, if you're training a 100-meter sprinter, and once every 4 weeks you have them do a 100-meter sprint in training, and they are getting faster each time, then that shows an improvement. You've got a sport performance outcome. Similarly, with a shot putter, if your shot putter is increasing the distance that they can put the shot, then that's a sport performance outcome. They are improving. If over those 4 weeks, however, your shot putter is not increasing the distance that they can put the shot, there's no change. Now the question is, how do we do this with combat sports? What kind of things can we measure as a sport performance outcome? Now, given that combat sports are sports of repeated, high intensity, high impulse actions over 6 to 31 minutes, then we need to think about how we measure those repeated high impulse actions. What physiological factors underpin those high impulse actions in order to repeat them for a long period of time? What physiological factors underpin the ability to fight for potentially 31 minutes? What kind of things should we be measuring as our sport performance outcomes? Now, my opinion in terms of the research that we're currently doing is that aerobic capacity, as measured by VO2 max, the intensity that an athlete can work at their VO2 max, as measured by something along the lines of velocity at VO2 max, and their ability to work at high percentages of ventilatory threshold 1 and 2, these could give us a strong indication as to how well they're going to be adapted to perform within their combat sports. Okay, so there's quite a lot of research required in this area to understand what our sport performance outcomes actually are from a physiological perspective. But the aim of a training camp is to bring about an improvement in sport performance. During a training camp, we should have decrements in sport performance, because that will mean they have acute negative stimuli to bring about chronic positive stimuli. But if at the end of a training camp, we either have no change in performance or a decrement in performance, then our training has not been effective. All right, guys, so hopefully you've got something from this brief chat. Hopefully this framework makes sense and you can start to think about how your training could fit into this framework and how you can use this within your practice. If you've got any questions, please jump on the chat, jump on the Discord, write some questions over to me. Happy to have a chat sometime. All right. Thank you very much.